Why don't you kick us off, Durhan?
Thank you very much, and good morning and good very early afternoon to those of you who are in in the Eastern Time Zone or into the Atlantic. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Durham Wong Rieger. I
Nope.
am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders, and we are so really thrilled that so many of you are joining us for what we hope will be the first of a series of webinars that CORT will be bringing forth with regard to the Canadian Rare Disease Drug Strategy and beyond for this fall, leading up to our conference, which we can give you a little bit more information about at the end of November. But because we've got a very, very full agenda, I'm going to pass it over directly to Bill Dempster. Anybody who's participated with us in any CORT event will know that Bill is our unofficial member of the core team, and but has been a huge, huge, I think, part of getting us to where we are today in terms of rare diseases. So I'm going to pass it over to Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs, who will moderate this session.
Thanks so much, Durhan. And as you know, because you all registered for it, the webinar is called Good to Go, Implementing Canada's Rare Disease Strategy. And we're thrilled to have the leaders at Health Canada who were involved in helping bring together the agreement, the bilateral agreement with British Columbia and the government of Canada. Very shortly, we're going to hear from Director General of the Office of Pharmaceutical Management and Strategies, Daniel McDonald, and two of his key leaders, Jennifer Grandy, Director of Governance and Bilateral Agreements, as well as Andrew Taylor, Director of Policy, Research and Data with the OPMS, is what folks here in Ottawa. I'm not actually in Ottawa today, but that's what we call it. We're going to then turn it over to get some early reactions. It's actually just a few weeks ago that this agreement came together, so there's been a lot of unpacking and figuring it out. Dr. Durhan Wong Rieger, who kicked off the webinar as President and CEO with the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. She'll also be representing the Canadian Rare Disease Network. She's on the steering committee for the CRDN to help figure out how this could actually fit in with everything that CORD and the CRDN are working to accomplish as well. On the line as well, we have Colleen Cox and Doug Grant. They are the country managers for Alnylam and Kyowa Kirin. These are the two companies that have products that will benefit from federal funding in terms of the British Columbia deal. What are their early reactions from on what happened on July 23rd? We're also joined by Dr. Jennifer Adams. She's a physician and a parent of a child with PH1 based in Ontario. A few logistical details. I mentioned it earlier. Please stay off video and kindly keep your microphone on mute. But we do need and want to hear from you because we've got tons of questions that are going to come forward. These are not going to go to waste. We're going to do our best to get to as many of them as we can. If we can't, and I expect we won't be able to, we will be bringing them together in terms of themes and hopefully having another webinar in the coming weeks and working very hard to have a provincial payer on the line as well, because I think we need to understand the provincial perspectives on not just this deal, but the national strategy for drugs for rare diseases. And I think that's about it. Let's turn it over to Health Canada. I'll direct the slides if that works for the folks on the line. I'll share this, and we'll hand it over to Health Canada to walk us through an update. Hopefully, we can keep this to 20 minutes if possible. I know it'll be a bit of a sprint. We want to have time for Q's and A's with you because this is a real treat to have you. But over to Daniel and your team. Please let me know when you want me to press ahead.
Thanks, Bill, very much. And thanks, Turan, Cord, and fellow panelists. So it's going to be easy. I'm not going to use the slides for my part of comments. I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who will pick up the first half, and it will close with Andrew. So that's the order of operations from Health Canada side. But just wanted to start by saying so grateful for everyone who took the time to hear from us today about the agreements and the broader national strategy. We do appreciate the opportunity to share what happened and where we're going on this, the final element to the implementation of the national strategy. I want to start by addressing right away a few things that we've been hearing since the launch of the national strategy last year, in fact, and not just through the signing of the bilateral agreements, but with respect to the broader strategy. And that's three things. Lack of transparency about the development of the common list of drugs, which I'm assuming everybody on the call is aware as a component of the bilateral agreements. Lack of clarity about what the national strategy and the bilateral agreements are even trying to accomplish, and what is the master plan, and why is it taking so long to move the money. So I'm going to open with some remarks on those elements, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, who's going to walk through in finer detail what it is that is contained in the bilateral agreements for everybody's edification. And we'll close with Andrew Taylor, who's going to speak about the relationship between the bilateral agreements and the rest of the national strategy in more definition. So with respect to those three questions, until now, we haven't really been in a position to respond directly to you on any of it. We've been hearing quite clearly. But now that the first agreement with British Columbia is signed and is now published, you can finally see for yourself the structure of what it is that we are doing, and finally, how all four pillars of the national strategy that we've been talking about for the last year work together to increase access to drugs for rare diseases now and in the future. So I'm going to start with the master plan for the bilateral agreements, which in turn will help to explain the drug list and the length of time that we took to develop it. So throughout the process, we told you that provinces and territories and Health Canada all recognize the opportunity that the federal funding represents. You probably heard me say that numerous times. Time was being taken to make sure that the common set of drugs was more than just a list of drugs. Now, what we meant by that, of course, is that we wanted to identify a list of drugs that would be made commonly available across the country. That was the express intention that was set out in the minister's announcement, and it was designed as an explicit first step in addressing the issue of postal code lottery. But you told us as well that you hoped that we would be able to achieve more with the funding, and we well understood your point. I mean, the three pillars of the national strategy that we had been talking about all the way up until the bilateral agreements, and I'm talking about evidence collection and use, about research, and about national governance, they're all explicitly designed to support decision-making around rare disease drugs with the existing pharmaceutical management system. So you can see now that the bilateral agreement is out, that these three pillars did actually signal where we were going with the bilateral agreements. So in the agreements, PTs will work together with Health Canada and other partners to develop projects in real-world evidence collection specifically for drugs for rare diseases. So the list directly supports PTs to provide drugs to the benefit of patients now, as Minister stated in the news release. But the list also forms the basis of evidence collection projects that will better enable provinces and territories to evaluate these and future drugs for rare diseases for reimbursement. I mean, the point is, after all, once you have a tool in place, you can use it whenever you need it. Better collection of the right data results in more efficient decision-making, which benefits access. That's been the theory that's underlied the three pillars that we've been talking about up to now. It's the same theory that underlies this work in the bilateral agreements. Now, practically speaking, you can see that the evaluation of some drugs for rare diseases would benefit from real-world evidence data collection to give more certainty to the reimbursement decision. It's just the nature of drugs for rare diseases that some of them, even going through the process, uncertainty will remain as to whether the drug is really what we hope that it is. But for other drugs for rare diseases, there is no need. So to support our forthcoming work, we needed to identify candidate drugs where meaningful evidence collection trials could be developed so that we could test concepts and methodologies in data collection and use. I mention that only so that I can speak to you more directly about what the list is, and more specifically, what the list is not. So there's been a lot of focus on the list about what it means to be on the list and how drugs will be placed on the list. So I'm hoping that you can see two things clearly now. First, the list is not a new drugs for rare disease approval route that operates outside of the existing pharmaceutical management system in Canada. every drug on the list, when it is published, will have passed through all the steps of Canada's system. Health Canada regulation, HTA recommendation, PCPA price negotiation. Second, and I want to be really clear about this, it follows that the list is not a value judgment by the federal government in conjunction with provinces and territories that some rare diseases should be put ahead of others on the basis of some chosen set of metrics. We never considered such a thing in this process. It would have been impossible, totally counterproductive to the strategy, even if we had done it or could have. We didn't need to concern ourselves with it anyway, because all drugs for rare diseases coming through the pipeline, including those in the common list and not yet announced, will continue to be assessed through all the steps of the pharmaceutical management system and, where successful, will be listed by PTs. That is to say, provinces and territories will continue to make new DRDs available to patients beyond this list as they always have. And you should also note, if you've read through the agreement or had the chance to, that even some of the federal funding to PTs through the bilateral agreement is going to be used to support the provision of drugs that aren't on the list. It's not exclusive only to the common set of drugs. What the list does is indicate where Health Canada and provinces and territories will continue to work together to develop evidence collection tools that will have broad application to future drugs. And to be clear, one more thing, this also does not mean that additional steps are going to be introduced into drug approval and listing processes that will slow down patient access to drugs for rare diseases that are on the common list. The idea is to develop decision support tools that will be integrated into the existing pharmaceutical management system. It is not to create additional steps in the existing system. So I just wanted to go through those points to illuminate what happened in the discussions between Health Canada and provinces and territories that led to this bilateral agreement structure. And I'm hoping will lower any fears you might have had about what's really going on here and the impact that this will have on you. Because we heard throughout that you would have preferred to be involved in the process directly to ensure that the process and the outcomes are patient-centered. And I want to cover 3 points about this. First, achieving a patient-centered outcome was central to the process. We did a What We Heard report after our national consultation phase, and we heard clearly from you 3 things: the need for faster and easier access to drugs for rare diseases, the challenges of the high costs of drugs for rare diseases, and the disparity in access across the country that was referred to as the postal code lottery. These messages were reinforced by very direct and sometimes critical messages that we heard from you throughout the process, and the knowledge that when we were finished, we would have to demonstrate to you how we were achieving these objectives. So looking at the national strategy as a whole, you can now see that we have been describing what we were putting in place as a lot of foundational work. It will take time to achieve these objectives, but it will be impossible without setting the right conditions for success, like having the right data and evidence in place for efficient decision making. And secondly, we recognized that we needed to be transparent about what the agreements are doing. And so we have built this into the bilateral agreements. So there is an Annex B to the bilateral agreements that sets out some requirements that, although preliminary and not yet defining any specific outcomes, are fully transparent about the commitment to test approaches around real-world evidence. We have committed to public communications about the identification of the drugs in the common list and the results of the strategy. So, for example, we've already established a web page to ensure timely sharing of the identity of drugs on the common list as that information is ready for release. And with negotiations wrapping up, you can see that there's still a lot of important work to come. That work will occur over this first 3-year phase, but the vision extends to future phases. Work plans will be developed and goals will be established. Other partners will be brought into the work to implement these ideas, lessons we learned, and work plans and goals will be adjusted. What roles will be asked of which partners, still to be determined, but obviously we hope for your support whenever we should ask for it. Now, that was what I wanted to cover sort of as an overview chapeau. I'm going to turn it over now, as I promised, to Jennifer to take us through more detail on the agreements.
Thank you, Daniel. Can everyone, sound is okay? So Bill, I'm going to start with slide 1, where we are. I'm mindful that we are like at minute 10 of the 20, so we'll try to get through this fairly quickly. So as Daniel mentioned, my name is Jennifer Grandy. I'm the Director of Governance and Bilateral Agreements, and I've been working with my team to lead the work to develop the bilateral agreements and the negotiations between Health Canada and willing provinces and territories. So starting on slide 2, please. So I just want to start by talking about, to remind everyone, where did we begin and what were our objectives as we set out to design these agreements. So people in Canada deserve timely access to the best possible health services and affordable medicines, regardless of where they live or their ability to pay. The Government of Canada, through the strategy, recognizes that concerted and collaborative efforts by federal, provincial, and territorial governments are needed to improve healthcare for Canadians and ensure access to medications for all, including those struggling with rare disease. So in March 2023, we saw the announcement of the investment of up to $1.5 billion over 3 years to support the national strategy for drugs for rare diseases, which we call the strategy with great affection, including up to $1.4 billion for the bilateral agreements with provinces and territories to help patients with rare diseases have access to treatments as early as possible. These were designed to be initially 3-year agreements, and they're part of the first phase of the strategy. So that's something I'd ask people to keep in mind throughout this, which is focused on building, testing, and learning in collaboration with governments and with health system partners. So lessons learned from these agreements, as well as from strategy-funded projects, which Andrew's going to talk about by Pan-Canadian partners, will be incorporated into the future design and building phases of the strategy. So this is very much phase 1, and it's build and test. And the Government of Canada has confirmed ongoing funding of up to $500 million per year for this. So the agreements are central to the ongoing commitment of both the federal and provincial governments to continue working together to improve access to innovative treatments, contribute to real-world evidence generation, and laying the groundwork for more informed decision-making and potential novel approaches to reimbursement. We recognize this is very complicated work and the importance of identifying and implementing achievable steps and taking an iterative approach to eventually address the needs of patients. This will positively impact, and to start addressing the needs of patients right now. This will positively impact Canadians living with rare diseases and their families over the longer term by enabling a system that is able to meet their needs. On to the next slide. So, as you may have heard us say before, the strategy is guided by 4 broad and multifaceted pillars to support activities that include, but aren't limited to, the coverage of particular drugs. Today, we're going to talk about pillar number 1, as this relates to the funding that's provided through bilateral agreements with willing provinces and territories. 2 to 4, or pillars 2 through 4 are also very important, and they're complementary components of the strategy. And Andrew's going to come back and talk about those after we walk through the agreements. And let's move on to the next slide, please. So, supporting patient outcomes and sustainability. There are 2 key aspects that fall under this. The first is the bilateral agreements, which is what we're here to talk about today. And the second is supporting eligible First Nations and Inuit patients living with rare diseases. To this effect, funding has been provided to Indigenous Services Canada's non-insured health benefits program, and that will run in parallel to the agreements in March and end in, which go up to the end of March 2027 for the first phase. Next slide, please. Okay, taking a breath. So, circling back to what Daniel's already alluded to, I'm going to start by talking about improving access to new DRD and the development of the common set. So you're going to hear me say common set sometimes I'm going to say common list. Agreement language is always common set, and we have built a number of our definitions and our mechanics of the agreement around that. So you'll often hear us say that. From a communications perspective, we were assured that common list is a little more understandable and makes a little more sense. So that's also used. They mean the same thing. It's just one is agreement language and one is how we tend to talk in news releases. So the common set was developed with provinces and territories to ensure that the strategy delivers the most benefits possible for patients with rare diseases. And that's what we mean when you hear us say more than just a list of drugs. So in describing the common set, the news release for the July 23rd announcement noted that it's recognizing the unique challenges associated with decision-making about rare disease drugs, and that the common list is designed to further the development, collection, evaluation, and use of real-world data and evidence in decision-making about the listing and reimbursement of rare disease drugs within Canada's existing pharmaceutical management system. So it's trying to do a lot of things here. And as Daniel has alluded to, through the DRD bilateral agreements, the provinces and territories are committing to ongoing work with the federal government and with each other to design and implement evidence collection projects that will support future collection and use of real-world data and evidence to inform ongoing decision-making about new rare disease drugs. We understand that robust, reliable, high-quality evidence is needed and that takes time, precision, and the engagement of partners to develop. The intent is to contribute to real-world evidence generation and to lay the groundwork for more informed decision-making and potential novel approaches to reimbursement in the future. I'm going to take a moment here just to talk about publications. So I'm going to, as you're looking through the agreement online, I'm sure you've noted that the list itself, which is Annex A, is redacted. This is done to respect various concerns around confidentiality and price negotiation. But the list of common set drugs as they are approved is on the Health Canada website, and we're happy to reshare that link. And information is also provided on drug election by province or territory as they sign agreements and as they do so. And that's done in collaboration with our provincial and territorial partners. The agreement states further in communications in terms of transparency that the new and emerging drugs that are on the common set will be revealed. So we and the provinces and territories have agreed to this, that they'll be revealed once following having reached the LOI stage with PCPA. And we're respecting the principle explicitly referenced in the preamble that the strategy operates within the existing pharmaceutical management system in Canada. We're also trying to respect the very important role that PCPA plays for Canadians. So there were 2 drugs announced on July 23rd, Poteligeo for the treatment of mycosis fungoides or Sézary syndrome, and Oxlumo for the treatment of hyperoxaluria type 1. Apologies there. Other drugs on the list will be publicly revealed as they successfully conclude PCPA negotiations. We can't reveal anything further about them at this time, about the list, about the number of drugs, etc. But I can confirm that the list for the first phase of the strategy has been determined already by PTs through an extensive collaborative process. The second thing I want to talk about in regard to the common list is the 2 elements of PT coverage requirements, and they cover election and eligibility. And these are words that you'll see throughout the agreement. So the agreement requires PTs to elect drugs from the common set for coverage. So that's to say that they will select drugs from the common set and say, we're going to make these available through the public plan, starting any time between the effective date of the agreement and March 31st, 2026. So they can add, subtract, expand their list of elected drugs anytime up to the end of year 2. This date aligns with the period of flexibility that enables PTs and partners to establish the evidence collection projects and work. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment when we get into parameters. There's a minimum requirement that there must be at least 1 drug elected at all times. So in order to get their funding, there always has to be at least 1 drug from the common set elected. And the optionality for PTs to elect which common set drugs was adopted in response to feedback to ensure that PTs are positioned to address the individual needs of their residents. But the expectation is that PTs who sign on to bilateral agreements are going to lean towards electing the drugs rather than not, since they did work together in selecting them. You will have seen that the news release for BC signing of the agreement, they're covering the 2 drugs that have now been published from the common set. In terms of eligibility, the news release makes clear that the federal funding is supporting the province in providing these drugs. That means that they are made available through existing PT programs. So we're not setting up new programs. We're not setting up new streams of distribution. These are provided through the PT programs, and they're subject to those eligibility criteria. Next slide, please. So as the slide says, and as Daniel's talked about, evidence collection generation is really key in all of this. I'm going to jump ahead and talk about Annex B here, which provides some more insight on this topic. And it's near the back of the agreement if anyone's following along. Through these bilateral agreements, PTs commit to real-world evidence collection. Daniel's talked a lot about this, and what the bilateral agreements call the evidence collection mechanisms in relation to the drugs in the common set. Annex B sets out what these commitments will be for future work. And they are high level at this point because we are still working with PTs on the development of a work plan based on the selection of the drugs and what will make sense. Annex B specifically does not define what the projects or outcomes are yet. These projects and opportunities are to be determined in partnership and according to what is deemed to be the most effective. Instead, it defines roles and commitments of ongoing support and collaboration. And noting too that this is part of what is the agreements cover the first 3 years of what is expected to be long-term multi-phase work. So two things about this. The work will involve a work plan that will be regularly monitored, and that's reflective of how evergreen and experimental this work will be over the rest of the 3 years. And it will involve partners beyond the provinces and territories, specifically the PCPA, but also others. The final aspect to point out about this further evidence collection work is that the agreement recognizes that this is going to take time to establish and operationalize. So for this reason, if you look at the funding parameters of the agreement, you'll notice that the provinces and territories have a great deal of flexibility over how their federal funds are used for the first 2 years. And to recognize this setup, there are no requirements in terms of allocation on federal funding for the cost sharing of the federal, the cost sharing of federal funding until the 3rd year. And I'll talk about that in more detail, I think, in 2 slides. So we're moving on to screening and diagnostics. And next slide, please. Turning now to screening and diagnostics, I just want to highlight the role of planning in this. So this is the second element of the agreements. So we have coverage for a common set of new drugs, and then we have the screening and diagnostics. This is the second element of the agreement that is describing ongoing common action involving all signatory provinces and territories. So this is another element where we're talking about getting provinces and territories to work together. And with screening diagnostics, it's not necessarily to arrive at the same end because everyone's in a different position, but at least to look at what do we need to consider and what can we learn from each other about screening and diagnostics in order to offer improvements as a whole. This aspect is much less defined, and as such, Health Canada is looking to utilize the expertise of key stakeholders in the country. There's 2 initiatives that we want to highlight in particular: the newborn screening panel and interaction with our implementation advisory group. So those provinces and territories who sign an agreement commit to working with Canada on developing and implementing a plan for improving screening and diagnostics for rare disease. So very high level and very much reflective of the fact that all the PTs find themselves in a different position. This planning is envisioned to take place over the first 2 years of the agreement, and with investments to begin no later than the 3rd year. Again, these are investments in longer term change with an orientation towards improvements across the health system as a whole. Next slide, please. So the third area supported by the agreement is improving the coverage of existing DRD. Daniel's alluded to the fact that the common set is just one area of drug coverage under these agreements, and that there is a significant portion of proceedings that can go towards the coverage of existing DRD. The agreement is structured such that funding that is not required for or used for the common set or the improvement of screening and diagnostics is used for improving coverage for existing DRD according to the individual context and circumstances of each province or territory and the needs of patients that reside in those jurisdictions. A final note here that eligible expenditures, we understand that this is not just about putting pills in hands and that there's a lot of associated costs around that. So it's not just about drug purchases, but that the section you see on eligible expenditures recognizes the additional costs of providing access to these. If anyone has questions about these, we're happy to take those offline and to discuss them, but they're described in fairly good detail within the agreement. Moving on to slide 9, please. I'd like to move to address how the federal funds must be utilized across the areas. So PTs have a lot of flexibility, as we said, during the first 2 years to utilize their funds on either the common set or other new DRDs or other DRDs or a combination. And the date, March 31st, 2026, aligns to that period of flexibility that enables PTs and partners to establish the evidence collection projects and work. After year 2, the agreements require that 50% of funding received must be allocated to support the funding set, the common set and its eligible expenditures, and it must be cost shared on a 90-10 basis with the federal government paying the larger share. With regard to screening diagnostics, it follows a similar formula where there's a great deal of openness in the first 2 years where they can spend up to 10% on the funding, but they must spend 10% of the funding on improvement of diagnostics and screening in the 3rd year. As I've already said, any funds not utilized for the above categories must be used to improve coverage of other new and existing DRD. Next slide. So BC was the first province to sign on January 23rd. We've already talked about their election of drugs, and they will receive $194 million over 3 years under the national strategy. And then finally, on to slide 11. I'm going to just talk quickly about the Implementation Advisory Group, which I've already mentioned, which is a group consisting of key stakeholders from across the rare disease space, which includes patients, clinicians, advocates, and drug plan experts, and pharmaceutical industry partners. And they will be helpful in providing advice on implementation to Health Canada and other health system partners. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew Taylor.
Sure. So I'm just I'm quite conscious of time, so I'm probably going to whip through my part of this as quickly as I can. I'm the director of policy research and data, and I've been working with Health Canada's partners at the Canadian Institute for Health Information, the Canada's Drug Agency, and the Canadian Institutes for Health Research to be able to support a range of other activities under the strategy. I mean, we know the agreements make up a sizable portion of the funding, but aspects related to research, collection, and use of evidence are really important for building that foundation that Daniel and Jennifer have been talking about, to ensure that the system capacity is there to be able to support the agreements and the overall strategy. So in terms of investing in innovation, we know that a well-rounded strategy recognizes the importance of research, and this is why we've been working with CIHR and particularly the Institute of Genetics to ensure that there are additional supports and key priorities that have been identified by the research community. Up until this point, we have, through CIHR, been able to release 4 funding opportunities related to rare disease clinical trials, diagnostic processes, monitoring of rare diseases, and as of now, all of the projects that will receive funding under those opportunities have been named, and all of that information is available on the CIHR website, which we're happy to share afterwards. There's a range of projects teams being supported to advance clinical trials and to improve a range of different pieces across Canada. And while we know that advancing rare disease broadly touches on all aspects of rare disease research, broadly touches on all aspects of rare disease generally, some of the work that we're doing under this sort of initiative related to real world evidence really helps to articulate some of the goals in the strategy agreements. Rare Kids Can is a clinical trials and treatment network that's being supported through these CIHR funding opportunities, and among a range of other daunting tasks and activities that they have on the go, supporting data science, real world data coordination and creation in the clinical trial space is something that they're working on, and this complements some of the other work that we're trying to support. We know that there are projects looking at genomics and care pathways and being able to use different processes to improve the diagnostics related to rare disease, and this very much links to some of the future planning that we need to do with PTs around what can be supported under the agreements and scaled across Canada. And we also are supporting different data and admin projects that are really helping us to understand and experiment with how we can use data to understand the prevalence, direct cost, and impacts of rare disease on the system. And this helps with data sharing and collaboration across hospitals and researchers in Canada. But the last sort of bullet on the screen as well around collecting and using evidence, this is where we're working with Canada's Drug Agency and the Canadian Institute for Health Information to launch a range of projects that have been successfully implemented and launched over the last year. And a range of these things, I hope, will seem familiar to you as they really touch on a lot of the similar themes that have been talked about in these agreements. So CDA is helping us to establish a newborn screening advisory panel looking to develop pan-Canadian guidance for newborn screening programs. Their initial work on principles and coordinated models and approaches and best practices is currently posted on the CDA website. It's open for your review and a consultation that ends on September 11th. So I encourage you to look at that and participate in the consultation work for their final report that's expected in early 2025. It's this kind of work that's helping to point to potential activities that we could support through the PT agreements and that future planning in the screening and diagnostic space. We're also, through the CDA, doing a range of activities related to rare disease registries, looking at developing an inventory, doing a preliminary assessment of those inventories on those registries in the inventory related to quality and comprehensiveness, really trying to help improve quality and completeness. And linked to that, we're also helping to develop registry standards and best practices. There's scoping review on recommendations for guidance right now, a range of work looking at linking registry data to admin data in the future. And there was an open request for funding proposals to be able to support the capacity of registries in Canada and to make and build the capacity to serve ongoing decision making. And we hope to do future RFP processes to continue that important work. And you can see in this registry work, we're hoping to ensure that the data that's in registries in Canada can effectively serve that ongoing decision-making around drugs. It's these activities that will really build the system capacity to use registry data to monitor cost, impacts, outcomes, utilizations of drugs over time, and will help to inform ongoing decision-making. And it's this work that's really foundational to realize the real-world evidence goals of the agreements and where we're trying to move forward with in terms of evidence generation projects and activities that are currently being explored by PTs and Health Canada. CDA is also supporting a range of a series of non-sponsored reviews through a formulary management expert committee pilot. That's an innovative, deliberative committee that's addressing the needs raised by PT drug plans, and which is incorporating patient and clinician engagement to be able to look at reassessment of recommendations over time. And this capacity to reassess will be important as we move forward with real-world evidence. And the CDA is also helping us to build a DRD pipeline repository to proactively monitor new DRD that may soon enter the market to support the PT drug plans and health system decision makers as we establish data capacity building needs and establishing what data is available, what's not, to be able to support evidence generation. And then we're working with CIHI to launch a range of tools that support these as well, including a formulary tool on public drug plans, a landscape report on drug data availability, and CDA and CIHI are working quite closely together now, looking at the feasibility of linking registry data to admin data and looking at doing case studies to see what kinds of questions we can answer. And there's additional publications related to the data learnings and the analyses specific to certain rare diseases that we hope to release in the fall. All of this information we can share as it's readily available on the CIHI and CDA websites. And it's being able to link and consolidate and draw on the learning from different data sources that's going to be essential for being able to operationalize the real world evidence generation that is being planned under the agreements. And it's through our partners' exploratory work that we're hoping to be able to help PTs identify what is possible and feasible moving forward. So I think I've probably taken up too much time. I do want to make sure that there's time for others. And I think we can end there by saying, from Health Canada's point of view, we're very excited to reach out and to hear from people, and we hope that this is an ongoing discussion.
That was terrific. Thanks so much, Andrew, Jennifer, and Daniel, for setting the stage. And let's turn it over to Durhan for some early reaction. And the chat has lit up. We've got over 200 participants, so keep that going. We'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible. But first, Durhan, where you sit, what do you think? And try to link in some of the Canadian Rare Disease Network questions that have come forward in the chat as well.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I echo my thanks to Health Canada, Daniel, Jennifer, and Andrew for not only doing this, but for remaining accessible to us. And I will follow with what Andrew said at the end, is we do hope this will be just the beginning, and we do plan for this to be just the beginning of a series of dialogues and webinars. So as you can see in the chat line, there's a whole host of questions that would make up more than one webinar in and of themselves. We will try to get answers. I mean, I think many people will know that CORD certainly had been pushing for the implementation, so we're very pleased that their bilateral agreements are being signed. I think Daniel presaged what some of our concerns were, because he's heard them not only from me but from others in terms of the transparency and the engagement of the clinicians and patients in terms of helping to develop these lists, and also really looking at other things that we could do in addition to the list. I think we're very excited about the fact that it does address what we have put forth in the ability to do screening, diagnosis, and at the other end of it, to be able to collect patient data and real-world evidence. What we don't have here, of course, are any mechanisms for how this will be done, and no requirements for how this will be done by the provinces with regard to the monies. And certainly we do not see a process, again, by which I think the most important participants in understanding what the screening and what the collection is, and that is the patient. So I think it's still, a lot of this is still being done outside of the most important constituents in here, and that is the rare disease community. So we are still, I think, wanting to make sure that we can open up that process. And good news in terms of seeing that the monies are there. Good news to see it is hopefully going to be for the drugs for rare diseases and in many aspects, but we do not see a process for engagement. And I know this is nothing new to any of the folks at Health Canada. They've heard me raise this, not just for me, but on behalf of many of our constituents. And as you will see from the chat list, is kind of what people are asking for. I do recognize that both Francois Beignet and Ian Stedman, who are a member of the steering committee for the Canadian Rare Disease Network, are on the line. I was going to pass to them to see if they'd like to say something, but we realize we're almost out of time, so I won't break off here. And hopefully we can have a real discussion around how this newly formed Rare Disease Network, which has been created to bring together all of the rare disease centers and the clinicians and certainly the patients and the family community to work collaboratively, and could be a huge instrument in terms of how we make sure that the right drugs get to the right people and that they will be monitored. What we don't see here, and I really am very concerned, is that there is not a pathway for accelerated access. One of our big concerns is how do we actually make sure we get drugs to people in a timely fashion? And the other thing that we don't see here, except for maybe as a byproduct, is the ability to bring in more drugs. And I think that's a huge component because we're still at only 60% of what the US and what the Europeans actually approve. So all of these are part of the components. We realize that everything can't be answered all at once, and we have recognized that this is an important step. I've been part of the Newborn Screening Advisory Group. I've been part of the registries community. I've been part of the ROA evidence, and so we have appreciated being part of it. We still have yet to see how these will address what we're raising here as some of the concerns around the implementation. So I won't go into more than that because I think hopefully we will, as Andrew just promised, that we will have ongoing opportunities for us to engage in future webinars, and that we can bring these questions up to answer not only in writing, but again, host these as a much more engagement exercise. So Bill, I'm going to stop there and pass it back.
Durhan, just to build on your question about getting from 60% up to a much higher number in terms of the number of medicines that come here compared to Europe and the United States, why don't we pass it over to the country managers for the two medicines that have been announced, get their reactions, and is this the kind of signal coming from Canada in terms of the new funding that's coming forward and how it's coming forward, that Canada is an interesting place to bring new medicines for rare diseases forward. So I don't know if Colleen or Doug want to jump on the screen. You're more than welcome to. We'd love to hear from you in whichever order you get on. There's Colleen. Well, first of all, why don't we go over to Colleen and then to Doug for some early reactions about the fact that your medicines are going to benefit for some funding for this, starting with BC and maybe in the rest of the country. Colleen, over to you first.
Sure. So thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction of the invite from Durhan and of course from Health Canada for walking us through sort of the overarching plan that we have in place here. So Oxlumo, so is Canada where we want to invest, where Alnylam wants to invest? Yes, it is. We run clinical trials here, and we bring our products to market. Is it the first market we come to? No, it's not. But we're definitely probably like the first one in the phase 2 after we get through, the US and EMA. We're very excited to see the BC announcement, but it was purely an announcement from our side. We didn't know until I received the press release forwarded to me by a colleague, because we did go through the full pharmaceutical approval pathway. We got approval in March of 2022. We had our CADTH recommendation in February of 23. PCPA reached out for a negotiation in September of 23, and we finally had a PCPA agreement in April of 24. So it went through all the standard processes, and whether or not we had been pre-chosen, we knew nothing about that as we went through the standard process. The only thing that was, we did go through an accelerated review because Oxlumo addresses primary hyperoxaluria type 1, easier to say PH1. Because there are no other treatments in Canada that are available for these patients. So we did go through the expedited pathway from that standpoint, but everything else went through the standard approach.
Thanks so much, Colleen. And Doug, over to you. How did you react to this? And then what does it mean? And I want to maybe bring that back to you, Colleen, as well. Going forward for your future pipeline, is this an important signal for innovators like you, Doug?
So thanks, Bill, and thanks, Durham, for the invite to do it. So, from a Kyowa Kirin side and from the drug Poteligeo that got put in the announcement, our story is pretty similar to Colleen's. So we would have had our NOC back in June 22. We would have went through CADIS and NS. We would have gone through PCPA to get our listing. Quite frankly, we were listed on the BC Cancer formulary because Poteligeo is a drug for cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, treating two particular rare conditions, mycoides fungoides and Sézary syndrome. Was listed, probably about a month before the Health Canada announcement came out. So much like you, Colleen, I got lots of congratulatory notes saying, well done, bravo. And pretty much that was kind of the first that I had heard about it on the announcements. So we are extremely glad and very happy that that has occurred. And I think it sends a positive message to kind of our headquarters, which I've obviously used in kind of pushing back to saying kind of, we were kind of put for some funding and here's where we're at. But there is a discordance with regards to the rest of the provinces because Poteligeo has been covered and listed in across almost all provinces except probably one. And BC would have been middle of the pack. So there is some challenging messages with regards to that announcement that says it was part of kind of the rare disease strategy with Health Canada and BC, but not the case for Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and the other provinces that did list Poteligeo. So there is a little bit of a mixed message and a little bit of a challenge to be able to sell it. It says, here's a signal where this new strategy will give our rare disease drugs an opportunity to be funded sooner and quicker for patients across the country with rare disease. But I think, it is nice to see, and I think it's a great start, but there needs to be more collaboration in being able to kind of message this for new drugs to come into the country. So hopefully that answers your question, Bill, and provides some context.
That's terrific, Doug, and thank you, Colleen. Why don't we turn it over to Jennifer Adams? Dr. Adams, are you on the line as well? Just as a mom of a child with PH1, what's your first reaction to this? I mean, you live in Ontario. The agreement's in BC. There's a real opportunity here. You would think for access for your daughter. Go ahead.
Yeah, you would think, but I don't actually know. It hasn't really changed much in my life at this point in time. Realistically, Ontario has just listed the drug on their public formulary and is actually kind of creating some issues for us because we're just stuck in a rock and a hard place because private insurance that is not covering it or is insufficient coverage for it, and then the limitations of that public system. We don't know what's going to happen with that, and it's quite scary to think. Also, it was brought up that provinces may list and then delist. That's a scary thought for me. Like, what's going to happen? So my daughter is on drug, it's being publicly funded. The province decides to take it off. What's going to happen? The Oxlumo was a lifelong medication. It's really scary to think about, and I hope that Health Canada will continue to involve patients and their families in these discussions to look at what those actual implications are moving forward for patients and families like ours.
Durhan, let's bring it back to you, and thank you, Dr. Adams. That's really appreciated your input. Something that struck me when I was reading the agreement is that there's a lot of requirements for reporting back on implementation, on which medicines are being covered or which investments go to medicines that are not on the list. And that actually addresses, I think, some of the questions in the chat. What if it's Health Canada approved, but didn't make it through the health technology assessment and the PCPA? could that extra 50% actually go to funding those medicines through exceptional access programs, et cetera? Durhan, do you want to elaborate on that kind of question as well? Because I think that might get to your accelerated access question, and then maybe somebody from Health Canada wants to jump back on and on that one.
Yeah, thank you very much. And huge thanks to Jennifer. I know she has actually a great deal more that she could share, which really shows the complexity of her, not just her own situation, but for many, many families that have both private and access to potentially public insurance, but it leaves them really, as she says, between a rock and a hard place when the private insurance maxes out and the public insurance is such that it's still, because it's going through the regular pathway, could leave her with humongous copays that are not going to be accessible. So this is not necessarily that quick fix in terms of an answer. I think a lot of the questions we see here, and I'm going to just speak on behalf of that, really talk about an accelerated timeline. So where do we get that? Nice to hear both Colleen and Doug acknowledge that this is in fact a nice nod to, companies, but it really doesn't actually solve what seems to be, drugs coming in will still have to go through the regular process and may still be caught in that same regular timeline and still with the vagaries of what is actually going to be approved. For me, one of the biggest questions that has come up, though, is what are we doing? We're talking about this is as Jennifer very clearly outlined, and Daniel did in his introduction, we're talking about needing to collect more data, real-world evidence, to demonstrate how well they work. But we do not see in here any requirements for how that would be done or whether this can be done consistently. I mean, yes, we could merge some of the CIHI data with some of the patient registries, but that, as we all know, we're sitting here in the trenches. That is not going to solve the problem. We would have loved to have seen monies going into the health system, into implementation. Bill, we worked so hard on the rare disease strategy and what needed to be funded in terms of an infrastructure. And now, thanks to really, Alberta and the support they've given us through their foundation, we do have a rare disease network. And it is absolutely imperative that we actually are able to help fund what that network could do in terms of bringing us all together, in terms of having a consistent, integrated, comprehensive care system. So I think there's so many ways in which this funding could actually be optimized to not only get drugs in, but also to ensure that they're going to be used optimally. And I think we need to, again, don't just talk to CDA, don't just talk to CIHI, don't just talk to, the administrators and the people that are running the drug plans to propose the list of drugs. You gotta engage and you gotta support the patient community, you gotta support the health system. As we know, I mean, maybe it'll come through the provinces, but not a penny of this money has been dedicated to either supporting the clinics and the implementation of a rare disease network, and certainly no money has gone to any patient associations who are working on behalf of our people to really make this happen. But we're doing it without any kind of real support from the governments to do this. And not that I'm kind of raising it up to say, hey, fund us, but we really are very concerned that there are many parts of this that could be optimized and we don't see it, and we're not going to see it unless we are engaged in terms of the implementation.
Can we turn it back to Health Canada then? Because there's two big questions that are coming forward. One, the level of flexibility through the BC agreement, especially for the first 2 years, and then ongoing 40% plus the 10% for screening. Could that go to support some of the activities that Durhan and others on the line are talking about? And then secondly, there's a lot of chatter online and some concern that are other provinces going to sign on to this? What's the status that you can share in terms of other provinces, like ones that Jennifer lives in, that don't have an agreement in place? Daniel, back to you, please.
Thank you very much I've been following along the chat, all the questions that are coming in, a lot of excellent questions. We're gonna have to take another time, I guess, to get to them all, but thanks for distilling it down to two. In terms of what will happen with the other provinces, I think you know me from the last year about not disclosing what's going on with negotiations. I'm going to continue to maintain that. There are discussions ongoing with other provinces, but I'm not at liberty to say yet which ones those are. That'll have to wait for the announcement when they ultimately sign. But I would hasten to add that there's a question in the chat about what happens. I'm in a province that has not signed. What does that mean for me? And I hope the tenor of my remarks about the bilateral agreements being situated within the existing pharmaceutical management system in Canada, and provinces and territories continuing the evaluation and eventual listing of drugs as they have been so far. All that it means substantively in terms of access to drugs is that if you have not signed a bilateral agreement, it does not mean that that drug will never be available in that province. I want to make that very clear. It just means that a province, making that drug available in their province, not having a bilateral agreement, simply will not have the assistance of federal funding to make that drug available. That's all that it means. But we do not anticipate that in a scenario where provinces ultimately do not sign on, that would mean that federally listed drugs would not be available in that province. It does not mean that at all. So I want to hasten that. If you just remind me what the first question was again, sorry.
It was more about the flexibility of the funding. Could that go to some of the initiatives that we've seen in the chat, the Canadian Rare Disease Network, some of the work that CORD is doing? Would that count for a province to be able to access that fund?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, and thanks for the question. So the bilateral agreement contains a section called eligible expenditures. And Jennifer did touch on it in her presentation. And so those are specified what it is. They're quite broad. And the intention there was to capture, to loop in another question came in, what is this money? Is it actually supporting the provision of drugs? Yes, it is. It is supporting the provision of the drug in the province or territory. But it also recognizes more broadly that there are more associated costs. Access is as important as the actual acquisition of the drug. So there is a broader set of eligible expenditures. Using those for, the funds for beyond that list, which are tied to the drugs for rare diseases as expressed within the agreement, wouldn't be allowed. But I wouldn't want to get into, determining, right now whether a specific expenditure, as you might be generally describing, would be eligible or not. We'd have to go through the details on that.
Durhan, any final questions or comments? Because I know we're at the top of the hour.
We are at the top of the hour, and I think on our part, we probably should have booked for like 2 hours. Though it is very challenging summertime, and I know people have many things to do, and we really appreciate everybody coming on, and Health Canada especially working with us. We had tried to get BC to join us, and I know that they have many things going on, and their not being able to provide somebody was not their lack of desire to do so. So we have a commitment that we will be able to come back and hopefully have provinces to support us, and maybe by that time have more signed agreements. What I'm going to do and what we're going to do is take all the questions that were put in. We're going to collate them and maybe organize them a bit better, organize a webinar that really will be able to address some of them systematically. But beyond that, we really need to do what we have been doing at CORD all along, and that is engage in consultations. So we have served over the last 4 or 5 years as a vehicle for hosting these kinds of events and bringing in the information, getting key people on. We would love to have CDA on. We'd love to have CIHI on. We need to have more of the rare kids on, and definitely the Canadian Rare Disease Network, of which I am so very excited in terms of where it can go. So we'll close it by saying thank you to everybody. I'm assuming, Daniel and Jennifer, that we can not only we'll post the webinar, but we can share the slides that you've shared with us today, and that people can expect that they can get access to those as well. But we will take your questions and put them together in a more comprehensive form, and hopefully, you will see many of them reflected as we host the next series of discussion. And just in closing, my huge thanks to Bill, as always, for masterfully taking us through this. I don't know if there's anything else, but just want to express my gratitude to everybody who joined us.
Durhan, maybe just mention the upcoming conference in Montreal and what's going to happen between now and then in terms of some webinars. I think you already did that in terms of engagement, but and there's a shout out from Ian on the line too, that the CRDN is certainly interested in hosting some of these engagement sessions as well. But let's talk about Montreal briefly, and then we'll close it out.
Yes, there is a town hall that the CRDN is in fact hosting in October. And want to make sure that as many people as possible will join that. We'll post that information and you can find it on their website as well. We will make that available. CORD, very excitingly, is co-hosting with RKMO, the Quebec Organization for Rare Diseases, a joint forum that will be taking place in Montreal. I don't think we've been together in Montreal for a good number of years now. It will be at the end of November on the, let me make sure I get this right. I think the 26th and the 27th. We will have some notices out. Huge opportunity, hopefully, for a lot of engagement at that time. So yes, we're looking forward to that. And there will, in fact, be a series of webinars between now and then that will allow us to maybe flesh out more the issues around the rare disease drug strategy and its implementation. And if I can, Bill, I want to do one more announcement. We are planning a expert patient leadership training program that we will bring back in. We did it about 3 years ago. We are expanding it, and some of it will very specifically help patients to better engage in terms of the rare disease drug strategy and the rare disease network.
Excellent. Well, special thanks to all the, especially Health Canada, who came on to walk us through the agreement, next steps, et cetera, and our guests from the two companies that hopefully will benefit from funding, and this is a good signal globally. And the PH1 doctor that came on the line as well. And thank you, Durhan. We'll see everyone in the coming weeks for other webinars like this. In the meantime, take care, enjoy the rest of your summers, and we'll see some of you, I'm sure, in October for the CDA Symposium in Ottawa. Take care, everyone.